In the winter of 1881, in the shadow of Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, a man could lose his soul to the cold before he ever saw spring. Elias Kane was no stranger to loss, but nothing prepared him for the night his world caught fire, literally. It wasn't just the blaze that devoured his saloon. It was the letter clutched in his frostbitten hands. It told him the daughter he'd buried 10 years ago might still be alive. The wind howled like a banshee through the skeletal remains of Bitter Creek, a half-forgotten mining town where Elias had carved out a life after the war. At 42, he was a man of grit and ghosts. His face weathered like the cedar planks of his burned-down saloon, the last chance. The fire had come 3 nights ago, not an accident but a message, set by men who wanted his land, his water rights, and his silence. Elias stood in the ash-strewn snow, staring at the blackened beams, his breath fogging in the moonlight. His Colt revolver hung heavy at his hip, untouched since the day he swore he'd never kill again. But that letter creased, stained, delivered. By a stranger who vanished into the storm, changed everything. "Your girl's alive," it read, in a scrawl that clawed at his heart. "Find her in Red Hollow, or they'll bury her for real." Elias hadn't cried in a decade, not since he laid a tiny coffin in the ground, believing his 6-year-old daughter, Lila, had been taken by fever. Her mother, Mary, had followed her into the earth a year later, leaving Elias with nothing but whiskey and regret. He'd built the last chance to drown his grief, serving miners and drifters who paid in gold dust and stories. And now, the letter burned hotter than the fire ever could. Red Hollow was a day's ride north, a lawless outpost where men like Amos Creed ruled with iron and greed. Creed, the cattle baron who'd been circling Elias's land like a vulture, had a reputation for breaking men's spirits before their bones. If Lila was alive, she was in Creed's shadow, and Elias knew the cost of crossing that line. He trudged back to the boarding house, the only shelter left in Bitter Creek, his boots crunching through snow that hid the scars of the fire. The town was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that felt like a held breath before a gunshot. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool and stale coffee. Mrs. Hattie Boone, the boarding house keeper, sat by the hearth, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome. She was a woman of 60, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, who'd seen enough of the West to know when trouble was brewing. "You're leaving, ain't you?" she said, not looking up. Elias set the letter on the table, its edges curling like a secret trying to escape. "Got no choice, Hattie. If she's out there," his voice cracked, raw as the wind outside. He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Hattie's needles paused. "Red Hollow's no place for a man alone, Elias. Creed's got men who'd shoot their own kin for $1. And you ain't held that gun for anything but show in years." She pointed to the Colt, its grip worn smooth by a past he'd tried to bury. "I'll manage," he said, but the words tasted hollow. He wasn't the man he'd been in 71, when he'd ridden with the Union and seen enough blood to last a lifetime. Now his hands shook when he poured coffee, and his dreams were haunted by faces he couldn't save. But Life, she was alive. If this wasn't some cruel trick, he'd walk through hell to find her. Hattie stood, her shawl slipping to the floor. She crossed to a locked trunk in the corner, opened it, and pulled out a small, tarnished locket. "Found this in the ashes of your place," she said, pressing it into his hand. "Thought you should have it." Elias's breath caught. The locket was Mary's, a gift he'd given her when Lila was born. Inside was a curl of auburn hair Lila's cut when she was 4. He hadn't seen it in years, thought it lost forever. His fingers tightened around it, the metal cold, but heavy with memory. "Thank you," he whispered, voice barely audible. Over the fire's crackle, "You watch yourself, Elias Kane," Hattie said, her eyes soft but fierce. "You're not just chasing a ghost, you're stepping into a wolf's den." He nodded, tucking the locket into his coat. Outside, the snow fell harder, blanketing the ruins of his old life. Tomorrow, he'd ride to Red Hollow, alone, armed with nothing but a letter, a locket, and a hope he wasn't sure he deserved. But as he stepped into the night, the wind carried a sound, a faint, distant cry, like a child calling through the storm. It was probably nothing, just the wilderness playing tricks. Or maybe it was everything. What would a man like Elias find in Red Hollow a daughter? A trap, or something far darker? In the winter of 1881, in the shadow of Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, a man could lose his soul to the cold before he ever saw spring. Elias Kane was no stranger to loss, but nothing prepared him for the night his world caught fire literally. It wasn't just the blaze that devoured his saloon. It was the letter, clutched in his frost-bitten hands, that told him the daughter he'd buried 10 years ago might still be alive. The wind howled like a banshee through the skeletal remains of Bitter Creek, a half-forgotten mining town where Elias had carved out a life after the war. At 42, he was a man of grit and ghosts, his face weathered like the cedar planks of his burned-down saloon. The last chance. The fire had come 3 nights ago, not an accident but a message, set by men who wanted his land, his water rights, and his silence. Elias stood in the ash-strewn snow, staring at the blackened beams, his breath fogging in the moonlight. His Colt revolver hung heavy at his hip, untouched since the day he swore he'd never kill again. But that letter creased, stained, delivered by a stranger who vanished into the storm, changed everything. "Your girl's alive," it read, in a scrawl that clawed at his heart. "Find her in Red Hollow or they'll bury her for real." Elias hadn't cried in a decade, not since he laid a tiny coffin in the ground, believing his 6-year-old daughter Lila had been taken by fever. Mother Mary had followed her into the earth a year later, leaving Elias with nothing but whiskey and regret. He'd built the last chance to drown his grief, serving miners and drifters who paid in gold dust and stories. But now, the letter burned hotter than the fire ever could. Red Hollow was a day's ride north, a lawless outpost where men like Amos Creed ruled with iron and greed. Creed, the cattle baron who'd been circling Elias's land like a vulture, had a reputation for breaking men's spirits before their bones. If Lila was alive, she was in Creed's shadow, and Elias knew the cost of crossing that line. He trudged back to the boarding house. It's the only shelter left in Bitter Creek, his boots crunching through snow that hid the scars of the fire. The town was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that felt like a held breath before a gunshot. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool and stale coffee. Mrs. Hattie Boone, the boarding house keeper, sat by the hearth, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome. She was a woman of 60, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, who'd seen enough of the West to know when trouble was brewing. "You're leaving, ain't you?" she said, not looking up. Elias set the letter on the table, its edges curling like a secret trying to escape. "Got no choice, Hattie, if she's out there?" His voice cracked, raw as the wind outside. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Hattie's needles paused. "Red Hollow's no place for a man alone, Elias. Creed's got men who'd shoot their own kin for $1, and you ain't held that gun for anything but show in years." She pointed to the Colt, its grip worn smooth by a past he'd tried to bury. "I'll manage," he said, but the words tasted hollow. He wasn't the man he'd been in 71, when he'd ridden with the Union and seen enough blood to last a lifetime. His hands shook when he poured coffee, and his dreams were haunted by faces he couldn't save. But Lila Fushi was alive. If this wasn't some cruel trick, he'd walk through hell to find her. Hattie stood, her shawl slipping to the floor. She crossed to a locked trunk in the corner, opened it, and pulled out a small, tarnished locket. "Found this in the ashes of your place," she said, pressing it into his hand. "Thought you should have it?" Elias's breath caught. The locket was Mary's, a gift he'd given her when Lila was born. Inside was a curl of auburn hair Lila's, cut when she was 4. He hadn't seen it in years, thought it lost forever. His fingers tightened around it, the metal cold, but heavy with memory. "Thank you," he whispered, voice barely audible. Over the fire's crackle. "You watch yourself, Elias Kane," Hattie said, her eyes soft but fierce. "You're not just chasing a ghost. You're stepping into a wolf's den." He nodded, tucking the locket into his coat. Outside, the snow fell harder, blanketing the ruins of his old life. Tomorrow, he'd ride to Red Hollow, alone, armed with nothing but a letter, a locket, and a hope he wasn't sure he deserved. But as he stepped into the night, The wind carried a sound of faint, distant cry, like a child calling through the storm. It was probably nothing, just the wilderness playing tricks. Or maybe it was everything. What would a man like Elias find in Red Hollow? A daughter, a trap, or something far darker? The trail to Red Hollow twisted through a canyon where the wind screamed like a warning, carving paths through snowdrifts that glittered under a half-moon. Elias Kane rode beside Tessa Navarro, their horses' breath steaming in the frigid night. The locket in his pocket felt like a heartbeat, urging him closer to Lilor, to whatever trap Amos Creed had set. Tessa's silence was heavier than the cold, her eyes scanning the cliffs above with the instincts of a hunted animal. Elias didn't trust her, not fully, but her story about her nephew, stolen by Creed's men, rang with a pain he knew too. Well, they were bound by loss, if nothing else, and that was enough for now. Red Hollow appeared at dawn. A cluster of ramshackle buildings hunched against the mountains like a bad hand of cards. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the faint clink of saloon glasses carried on the breeze. But there was no warmth, here just the stench of greed and gunpowder. Elias reined in Juniper, his gaze fixed on the town's main street, where a gallows stood, weathered but sturdy, a reminder of Creed's brand of justice. "This place feels like a graveyard," he muttered. "Feels like one because it is." Tessa replied, her voice low. She pointed to a faded sign above a boarded-up general store. "Red Hollow, EST, 1876. Creed's been bleeding this town dry since the gold ran out. Those who don't bend, break." They tethered their horses behind a crumbling stable and crept toward the edge of town, keeping to the shadows. Tessa led the way, her rifle slung low, her steps silent as a coyote's. Elias followed, his Colt ready, but his heart unsteady. The scarf he'd found, blue, child-sized, stained with blood, burned in his saddlebag. He hadn't shown it to Tessa yet, unsure if it would break her or make her reckless. Their plan was simple: find the Blackthorn Saloon, Creed's stronghold, and search for any sign of Leela or Tessa's nephew, Mateo. But plans in Red Hollow had a way of unraveling. As they rounded a corner, a shadow moved a man, broad-shouldered, with a scar splitting his brow. He wore a deputy's badge, tarnished, but gleaming with authority. "Well, now," he drawled, hand resting on his pistol, "ain't you two a sight? For Creed don't like strangers sniffing around." Elias stepped forward, his voice steady despite the pulse hammering in his throat. "We're just passing through. No trouble." The deputy smirked, his eyes flicking. "To Tessa, you're Kane, ain't you? And you?" He tilted his head, studying her. "Heard you ran off after Creed took your kin. Should have stayed gone, Navarro." Tessa's face didn't change, but her fingers twitched toward her rifle. "Tell Creed I'm here for what's mine," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. The deputy's laugh was cut short by a shout from the saloon. Two more men emerged, rifles drawn, their faces hard as the Montana rock. Elias's hand hovered over his Colt, but Tessa's glance stopped him, a warning to wait. "We don't want blood," she said, loud enough for the men to hear. "Just answers. Answers cost," the deputy said, stepping closer. "And you ain't got the coin." He lunged, faster than Elias expected, his fist aimed at Tessa's jaw. She dodged, quick as a snake, and drove the butt of her rifle into his gut. He doubled over, gasping, but the other two were already moving, their rifles raised. Elias didn't think he acted. His Colt barked, the shot kicking up dirt at the feet of the nearest man. "Next one's in your chest," he growled, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. The men froze, their eyes darting between Elias and Tessa. For a moment, the only sound was the deputy's wheezing. "Let's talk," Tessa said, her rifle now aimed at the deputy's head. "Where's Mateo? Where's the girl?" The deputy spat, blood flecking the snow. "You're dead already, Navarro, both of you." But his eyes flicked toward a narrow alley behind the saloon, a fleeting betrayal of fear. Tessa nodded to Elias, and they backed away, keeping their guns trained on the men. The alley was dark, littered with broken crates and smelling of rot. At its end, a door hung ajar, leading to a cellar beneath the saloon. Tessa hesitated, her breath catching. "If they're here, they're down there," she whispered. But Creed's men guard their secrets like gold. Elias pulled the locket from his pocket, its weight grounding him. Then we take those. Secrets, he said, his voice harder than he felt. He pushed the door open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of earth, and something sharper. Fear, maybe, or despair. Tessa lit a match, its flicker casting jagged shadows on the walls. They descended, step by creaking step, until they reached a locked iron gate. Beyond it, a faint whimper echoed, small and fragile, like a child's cry. Ilyas's heart stopped. "Leela," he called, his voice breaking the silence like a stone through glass. The whimper stopped, replaced by a rustle, then silence again. Tessa gripped his arm, her eyes wide with something between hope and dread. "Careful, Kane," she whispered. "This is too easy." But Elias was already reaching for the gate, his fingers trembling as they brushed the cold iron. The locket burned against his chest. And the cry echoed again, pulling him forward like a rope. Was it Lila? Was it Mateo? What was Red Hollow about? To swallow them whole? What waited beyond that gate? And would Elias and Tessa survive long enough to find out? The air in the cellar beneath the Blackthorn saloon was thick with damp earth and dread, the kind that clung to your bones like frost. Elias Kane stood before the iron gate, his fingers gripping the rusted bars, the locket in his pocket pulsing like a second heart. The faint whimper from beyond the gate, small, fragile, achingly familiar, had stopped, leaving a silence that felt like a held breath before a scream. Tessa Navarro stood beside him, her match flickering, casting jagged shadows that danced, like ghosts on the stone walls. Her face was a mask of resolve, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "We don't have much time," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the drip of water somewhere in the dark. "Creed's men will be back." Elias nodded, his jaw tight. He pulled a crowbar from his satchel, scavenged from the alley's debris, and wedged it into the gate's lock. The metal groaned, resisting, but years of hauling barrels in his saloon had made his hands strong. With a sharp crack, the lock gave way, and the gate swung open, its hinges screaming into the void. "If that's Lila in there," he said, his voice low and raw, "I go." First, she met his gaze, her obsidian eyes searching his. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, not trust, not yet, but a shared desperation that bound them tighter than any rope. She nodded, stepping back, and Elias descended into the darkness, the crowbar still in his hand. The cellar was a maze of crates and barrels, the air heavy with the sour tang of spilled whiskey and something sharper blood, maybe, or despair. The matchlight barely reached the corners, but Elias's eyes adjusted, catching shapes in the gloom, chains bolted to the walls, a pile of straw in one corner, and a small wooden crate, its lid ajar. The whimper came again, softer now from inside the crate. His heart lurched. "Lila," he called, his voice breaking like glass. The crate shifted, and a small hand reached out, pale and trembling. Elias dropped to his knees, the crowbar clattering. To the stone floor, he pulled the lid open, revealing a boy, no older than 10, curled tight, his dark hair matted with dirt. His eyes, wide and terrified, locked onto Ilyas's Mateo. Tessa gasped, pushing past Elias, her rifle forgotten, knelt beside the boy, her hands trembling as she touched his face. "It's me, Paquego. It's Tessa." Mateo's lips quivered, but he didn't cry. They took her," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The girl. She was here, but they took her this morning." Elias's blood ran cold. "What girl?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. He pulled the blue scarf from his satchel, holding it up. "Was she wearing this?" Mateo nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "She said her name was Leela, said her pa was coming for her. But Creed's men, they said she's bait. For you." The words hit Elias like a bullet. Bait. The letter, Sapphire, the scarf, it was all a trap, and he'd walked right into it. He stood, his hands clenching into fists, the locket burning against his chest. "Where'd they take her?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. Mateo pointed to a narrow tunnel at the far end of the cellar, its mouth barely visible in the dim light. "Through there, to the old mine. Creed's got a place." A hideout. Tessa pulled Mateo into her arms, her face a mix of relief and fury. "You're safe now," she murmured, but her eyes were on the tunnel, hard as flint. She turned to Elias. "Creed's playing us, Kane. He knew you'd come, knew I'd follow. We walk into that mine, we might not walk out." "Then we don't walk," Elias said, picking up the crowbar. "We fight." He looked at Mateo, then at Tessa, and saw the same fire in her eyes that he felt in his gut. Lila was close. He could feel it, like a pull he couldn't explain. But so was Creed, and the man didn't build an empire by leaving loose ends. They helped Mateo, too. His feet, his legs shaky, but steady enough to move. Tessa tore a strip from her cloak to bind a cut on his wrist, her hands quick but gentle. "You stay behind us," she told him, her voice soft but firm. "No heroics, Pequego." They moved toward the tunnel. A shout echoed from above Boots. On the saloon floor, voices sharp with anger. Creed's men had found the broken gate. Elias glanced at Tessa, who nodded, her rifle ready. "We're out of time," she said. "Move." The tunnel was narrow, its walls slick with damp and streaked with ore that glittered faintly in the matchlight. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the mountain itself was pressing down. Elias led the way, crowbar in one hand, Colt in the other, his heart pounding with every step. Mateo's words echoed in his mind. Bait. Lila was alive, but she was a pawn in Creed's game. Every second brought them closer to a reckoning at the tunnel's end. A faint glow flickered, a lantern maybe, or a fire. Voices drifted through the dark, low and menacing. Elias tightened, his grip on the Colt, the weight of it familiar now, like an old friend he'd sworn never to see again. Tessa's hand brushed his arm, a fleeting touch that grounded him. "Whatever's waiting," she whispered, "we face it together." But as they stepped into the light, a shadow moved, a figure too small to be a man, too quick to be a ghost. And then a voice, small and trembling, called out, "Pa." Was it Lila, or was Red Hollow about to break Elias's heart all over again? The tunnel beneath Red Hollow's old mine was a throat of stone, swallowing Elias Kane, Tessa Navarro, and young Mateo as they pressed deeper into its dark heart. The lantern Tessa carried flickered, casting jagged shadows that seemed to claw. At the walls, Elias's hand gripped his Colt, the crowbar tucked into his belt, his ears straining for the echo of that voice. "Pa!" that had pierced him like a blade. Was it Lila, his daughter, lost for 10 years? Or was it another of Amos Creed's cruel games? The air was heavy with the temps of rust and decay, and every step felt like a descent into judgment. Tessa kept Mateo close, her rifle ready, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Stay sharp, Kane," she whispered, her voice taut. "Creed's men don't leave loose ends." Mateo clung to her side, his small frame trembling but his jaw set, mirroring the defiance in his aunt's face. Elias nodded, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. The locket in his pocket, holding Lila's curl of auburn hair, was a lifeline he couldn't let go. The tunnel opened into a cavern, ceiling braced with rotting timbers that groaned under the mountain's weight. A single lantern hung from a beam, its light revealing a grim scene. Chains bolted to the rock, a pile of tattered blankets, and a small figure huddled in the corner. Elias's breath caught. It was a girl no older than 16, her auburn hair tangled, her dress torn but patched with care. She looked up, her eyes wide and green, just like Mary's. "Pa!" She whispered again, her voice breaking. "Lila." Elias staggered forward, dropping to his knees before her. His hands hovered, afraid to touch, afraid she'd vanish like a dream. "Is it really you?" The girl nodded, tears streaking her dirt-smudged face. "I thought you were dead," she said, her voice trembling. "They told me you were gone, after the fever." Elias pulled her into his arms, his own tears burning as he held her tight. The locket pressed between them. She was taller now, her face sharper. But she was his Lila, alive against all odds. "I'm here," he choked out. "I'm here now." Watched, her expression unreadable, but her grip on Mateo tightened. "We need to move," she said, her voice cutting through the reunion. Creed's men are close. I hear boots. Elias helped Lila to her feet, her hands cold but strong. Who took you? He asked, his voice hardening. Lila's eyes darkened. Creed, he found me 2 years ago in an orphanage in Bozeman. Said I was. Leverage? For your land? For the water rights. She hesitated, glancing at Tessa. Then back at Elias. He said you'd come, that you'd fight for me. But there's something else. Something he's hiding. Before Elias could press her, a shot rang out, echoing through the cavern. Tessa shoved Mateo behind a crate, her rifle snapping up as 3 of Creed's men emerged from a side tunnel, their guns drawn. The leader, a wiry man with a scarred lip, grinned. Kane, you're predictable as a sunrise, he sneered. You Navarro, Creed's gonna enjoy skinning you slow. Elias pushed Lila behind him, his Colt raised. Let us walk, he said, his voice steady despite the odds. You don't want this fight, the scarred man laughed, cocking his pistol. Creed wants you dead. The girl's just a bonus. Tessa fired first, her shot grazing the man's shoulder. He cursed, and chaos erupted. Bullets ricocheted off the stone, splintering crates and kicking up dust. Elias dove for cover, pulling Lila with him, his own shots precise but careful. He hadn't fought in years, but muscle memory held. Tessa moved like a shadow, her rifle barking, dropping one man before he could aim. Mateo crouched low, clutched the blue scarf Elias had found, his eyes wide but fierce. The fight was brutal. But quick! The scarred man fell last, his pistol skittering across the floor. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Elias checked Lila, her arm grazed, but not bleeding. Tessa knelt by Mateo, her hands shaking as she wiped blood from his cheek, not his. Thank God. But then Lila spoke, her voice low, urgent. There's something you need to know, Pa, about Creed. And her. She pointed at Tessa, her eyes narrowing. Elias froze, his gaze snapping to Tessa. What's she talking about? Tessa's face paled, her rifle lowering. It's not. What you think, she said, but her voice wavered, betraying a crack in her armor. I was going to tell you. Tell me what? Elias's hand tightened on his Colt, the air between them electric with suspicion. Lila stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. Creed said Tessa worked for him, years ago. She's the one who found me, and told him where I was. The words hung like smoke, choking the cavern. Tessa's eyes met Elias's, raw with guilt and defiance. It's true, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I was young, desperate. Creed owned my debts, my life. I found your daughter, but I didn't know what he'd do. When I learned, I ran. That's why I'm here now, to fix it. Elias's heart roared, torn between betrayal and the flicker of trust he'd built with Tessa. The locket burned against his chest, a reminder of what he'd lost, stand what he'd found. But the sound of boots echoed again, closer now, and the cavern walls seemed to close in. Creed was coming, and the truth about Tessa was only the beginning. Could Elias trust Tessa to fight by his side, or had she led him straight into Creed's trap? The cavern beneath Red Hollow's mine pulsed with danger, the lantern's glow flickering like a dying star. Elias Kane stood shoulder to shoulder with Tessa Navarro, their weapons raised as the sound of boots grew louder. Amos Creed's men. Closing in. Lila, Elias's daughter, clung to his side, her green eyes fierce despite the fear etched into her face. Mateo, Tessa's nephew, crouched behind a crate, clutching the blue scarf like a talisman. The air was thick with dust and the promise of blood, and Elias's heart pounded with a truth he couldn't shake. Tessa's confession that she'd once worked for Creed, that she'd found Lila had, cracked the fragile trust between them. But the locket in his pocket, holding Lila's curl of auburn hair, anchored him. He'd come too far to turn back now. Stay close, Elias whispered to Lila, his Colt steady in his hand. Tessa glanced at him, her obsidian eyes unreadable, but her rifle was aimed at the tunnel's mouth. No more secrets, she said, her voice low but firm. We end this together. Before Elias could respond, the cavern erupted. Creeds. Men, 5 of them, armed to the teeth, stormed in, their rifles blazing. Elias dove, pulling Lila behind a boulder, his shots ringing out in the chaos. Tessa moved like a shadow, her rifle dropping one man before he could fire. Mateo scrambled to safety, his small form disappearing into the dark. Bullets ricocheted off the stone, splintering timbers above, and the cavern groaned as if the mountain itself was waking. Enough. A voice boomed, cutting through the gunfire like a blade. Amos Creed stepped into the light, a towering figure in a black duster, his face carved with cruelty and confidence. His silver hair gleamed under the lantern, his eyes cold as the Montana winter fixed on Elias. "You're a stubborn man, Kane," he said, his voice smooth but venomous. "Should have stayed in Bitter Creek, should have let the fire take you." Elias stood, his Colt trained on Creed's chest. "Where's my daughter's life worth to you?" he growled. "What's this all for?" Creed's smile was a predator's, slow and sharp. "Water, Kane? Your land sits on the only spring feeding this valley. I take it, I own Red Hollow. I own everything." He glanced at Leela, then at Tessa, and his smile widened. "But you're here for a lie." Elias's blood ran cold. "What lie?" Creed stepped closer, ignoring the guns aimed at him. "Tell him, Navarro. Tell him what you really did." Tessa's face paled, her rifle wavering. "Don't," she whispered, but Creed's laugh filled the cavern, cold and cruel. "She didn't just find your girl," Creed said, his eyes glinting. "She took her, from Bozeman, from that orphanage. Because I paid her to. Because she needed the money to save her sister Mateo's mother. Ain't that right, Tessa?" The words hit Elias like a sledgehammer. He turned to Tessa, his Colt trembling in his hand. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice breaking. Lila's grip on his arm tightened, her eyes searching Tessa's face. Tessa's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her. It was years ago, she said, her voice barely audible. "My sister was dying. I had no choice. I didn't know Creed would keep her, Kane. I thought he'd let her go." Tears streaked her face, but she didn't look away. "I've been running from that mistake ever since. That's why I came back. For her, for Mateo." Elias's world tilted. The locket burned against his chest, a reminder of the daughter he'd thought he'd lost, and now, the woman he'd trusted had betrayed him. But Lila's voice cut through the haze. "Pah," she said, her hand on his arm. "She saved me. Last night in the cellar, she slipped me a knife, told me to hide it. She's been helping us." The plot twist landed like a thunderclap. Tessa hadn't just found Leela, she'd been working against Creed from the inside, risking everything to undo her past. Elias's eyes met Tessa's, and he saw it now, the guilt, the redemption, the fire that had driven her to this moment. Creed's men raised their guns, and Creed himself drew a derringer from his coat, its barrel, aimed at Lila. "You're all loose ends," Creed snarled. "And I don't leave loose ends." What happened next was a blur of instinct and fury. Elias fired, his shot grazing Creed's arm, forcing the derringer to clatter to the ground. Tessa lunged, tackling Creed, her knife flashing as she pinned him to the stone. The remaining men hesitated, caught off guard, and Elias took them down, with precise, desperate shots. Mateo emerged from the shadows, swinging a broken plank at the last man's knees, sending him sprawling. The cavern fell silent, save for Creed's labored breathing and the creak of the timbers above. Tessa stood over Creed, her knife at his throat. "This ends now," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears in her eyes. "For Mateo. For Leela, for every soul you've broken." Elias stepped forward, Leela at his side, and looked down at Creed. "You don't own this valley," he said, "and you don't own us." He turned to Tessa, his heart heavy but clear. "Need to." Tessa's hand trembled, but she didn't strike. Instead, she bound Creed's wrists with a length of chain, her eyes never leaving his. "You'll face a judge," she said, "not a blade. That's the difference between us." They emerged. From the mine, as dawn broke over Red Hollow, the sky a soft gold that promised spring. Lila leaned against Elias, her warmth grounding him, while Mateo clung to Tessa, his small hand in hers. The town was waking, its people gathering his word. Spread of Creed's fall. Elias looked at Tessa, the weight of her betrayal and redemption settling between them. You should have told me, he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only understanding. I know, she replied, her eyes soft but steady. But I couldn't lose you, not when we were this close. Elias nodded, pulling the locket. From his pocket, he opened it, showing Leela the curl of her hair, and her smile was brighter than the sunrise. We're going home, he said, and for the first time in years. The word felt real. As they rode out of Red Hollow, the town's gallows stood empty, a symbol of justice reclaimed. The fight for Bitter Creek's water rights would continue. But Elias knew they'd face it together. Him, Leela, Tessa, and Mateo. The West was harsh, but it taught you one truth. Family wasn't just blood. It was the people who fought for you, who stayed when the world burned down. In the late 19th century, Montana's mining towns like Red Hollow were battlegrounds for water and land, shaping the West's history. Men like Amos Creed weren't just fiction, they were real, their greed driving conflicts that tested the spirit of frontier communities. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to join us for more tales of the Wild West. Tell us in the comments, what would you risk everything to fight for?